He had bought the property for one simple reason. He wanted quiet. After years of living in crowded neighborhoods where every sound traveled through thin walls, he wanted space, air, and land that felt like it belonged to him alone. The listing had promised exactly that. A wide lot, old trees, and a clear boundary marked by worn wooden posts that had been there longer than most of the houses nearby. The neighborhood looked calm when he first moved in. Clean streets, trimmed lawns, and neighbors who waved but didn't linger. There was an HOA, but his property sat right on the edge of it. The paperwork was clear. His land was not governed by their rules, even though it bordered several HOA homes. The real estate agent had pointed that out carefully. He remembered the words clearly because they mattered to him. "You're adjacent, not included," the agent had said. "You're free?" For the first few months, that freedom felt real. He fixed up the old shed, planted a few shrubs, and spent mornings drinking coffee outside. No one bothered him. No notes on the door, no emails, no complaints. Then one afternoon, while he was repairing a loose fence panel near the back of the lot, he noticed a woman standing on the other side of the property line. She didn't say hello. She just stood there with her arms crossed. Watching him work, he nodded politely and went back to what he was doing. After a few minutes, she cleared her throat loudly. "That fence is crooked," she said. He looked up, surprised by the sharp tone. "It's an old panel," he replied calmly. "I'm fixing it." She frowned as if that answer offended her. "Well, it affects the look of the neighborhood." He wiped his hands on a rag. "This isn't HOA land." She smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "We'll see about that." She walked away without another word. At first, he didn't think much of it. Every neighborhood had someone who liked to comment on things that weren't their business. He went on with his day and forgot about the exchange. 2 days later, he found a printed letter tucked into his mailbox. It wasn't mailed. It had no stamp. The letterhead read HOA compliance. Notice the letter claimed he was in violation for improper fencing, appearance, and unapproved structure, maintenance. It warned that continued known compliance could result in fines. He read it twice, then laughed out loud. It had to be a mistake. He called the number at the bottom of the page. After being transferred twice, he finally spoke to someone who sounded unsure. "There must be an error," he said. "My property isn't part of the HOA." There was a pause. Papers shuffled. "Well," the voice said slowly, "our records show that area as shared boundary space." "Shared with who?" he asked. "With the community," the person replied. He stayed calm. "That's not accurate. I have the deed." "I have the survey." Another pause. "You can submit documentation for review." That was the first time he felt a flicker of concern. Not fear, just irritation. He scanned his documents that evening and emailed them over. He expected that to be the end of it. It wasn't. The woman from the fence began appearing more often. Sometimes she stood near the edge of his property, pretending to inspect her phone while clearly watching him. Other times, she spoke loudly to neighbors about people who don't respect community standards. One morning, he woke up to find small decorative stones placed several feet onto his land. They formed a curved line, as if marking a garden bed that hadn't been there before. He moved them back. The next day, they were returned, this time with a few flowers planted between them. That's when he decided to address it directly. He waited until she came outside and approached calmly, keeping his voice steady. "Those stones are on my property," he said. "I need you to remove them." She looked shocked, as if he had accused her of something terrible. "This has always been my yard," she replied. "That's not true," he said. "The boundary is right here." She shook her head. "That old survey is wrong. Everyone knows the line runs farther back." He didn't argue. He simply said, "I'll have it verified." She laughed. "Good luck." Within a week, he hired a licensed surveyor. He wanted everything done properly. No guessing, no assumptions, just facts. While waiting for the survey date, the HOA letters increased. This time, they weren't just about fencing. They complained about where he parked his truck, how his trash bins were placed, and even accused him of unauthorized land use. Each letter felt more aggressive than the last. He responded once, attaching his deed again. After that, he stopped replying. He had learned that arguing without final proof only gave people more room to push. The survey crew arrived on a clear morning. Bright vests, measuring tools, and tripods dotted the yard. The woman appeared almost instantly. She marched over. Demanding to know who authorized the work, he handed her the surveyor's card. "It's my land." She scoffed and pulled out her phone, recording the crew while muttering about legal action. The survey took most of the day. Stakes were placed. Lines were marked. Red flags fluttered gently in the breeze. The results were clear. His property extended farther than anyone expected. Much farther. The line didn't just prove the stones and flowers were on his land. It showed that nearly a third of what the woman had been using as her backyard wasn't hers at all. When the surveyor explained it, the woman's face drained of color. For the first time, she didn't have anything to say. He thanked the crew and paid them. That evening, he sat on his porch, staring at the flagged line that now cut cleanly across the grass. He felt a mix of emotions. Relief, because the truth was finally visible. Disappointment, because he knew this wouldn't end quietly. Sure enough, the next HOA notice arrived the following day. This one accused him of encroachment and threatened immediate action. He smiled as he read it. They hadn't seen the survey yet, and that was when he realized something important. This was never about rules or appearance. It was about control. Someone had assumed his silence meant weakness. Someone had mistaken patience for permission. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in a folder marked Records. He already knew what his next step would be, and once it started, there would be no undoing it. The next morning, the homeowner woke up with the feeling that nothing would be simple again. The previous day had shown him the truth, but it had also shown him the other side's determination to ignore facts. He knew the HOA Karen wouldn't give up easily. She had invested too much time, energy, and ego into claiming what was never hers. And now that the property line was officially marked, she had to confront it. Or at least he assumed she would. He stepped outside, coffee in hand, and looked at the stakes fluttering in the breeze. The boundary was clear. There was no doubt. Yet across the line, he noticed movement. The woman appeared at her back door, pacing, muttering to herself. She seemed to be calculating, planning her next move. The peaceful mornings he had once enjoyed were gone. In their place was tension, thick as fog. Neighbors began noticing the shift too. People who had once waved politely now kept their distance. Some whispered behind fences and hedges, curious about what was happening. A few stopped by casually, offering warnings. "Careful with her," one neighbor said quietly. "She's complicated," another added. "She's been like this with others before." But the homeowner didn't need warnings. He had his documents, the survey, and the law on his side. It didn't take long before the HOA Karen decided to act. The first move was subtle. She began landscaping directly on what he had learned was his property. Tiny bushes appeared overnight, carefully arranged. Decorative garden statues were moved to lines he had just marked. He didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he took photos and notes. Every action she made that crossed the boundary was recorded. He knew that any confrontation without proof would only make her more aggressive. Days turned into weeks, and the behavior escalated. The woman started sending letters again. The first few were polite on the surface, but underneath they were threatening. "You are encroaching," one letter claimed, "and continued violations may result in legal consequences." He read each one carefully, noting the dates, wording, and tone. Unlike before, he didn't respond immediately. He knew that reacting hastily would give her more ammunition. He called his lawyer, who had handled minor property disputes in the past. After reviewing the deeds survey and HOA letters, the lawyer confirmed what he already knew. "You're within your rights," the attorney said. "But be prepared. Some people escalate when they feel cornered. Keep detailed records of every interaction." His advice became his new routine. He documented everything meticulously. Photos were taken daily, letters were scanned, and every interaction with the HOA or the woman was logged with time and date. He even recorded phone calls where legally permissible. Soon he had a clear timeline of the ongoing harassment. The next incident was more direct. He woke one Saturday morning to find a small group of HOA board members standing near his fence line. The woman led the group, pointing and speaking animatedly. Their eyes scanned the yard as if searching for a problem that didn't exist. The homeowner stepped outside calmly. "Good morning," he said. "Can I help you?" One of the board members, a tall man with a clipboard, spoke first. "We've come to inspect possible encroachment," he said. He gestured to the survey stakes. The surveyor marked the official property lines. "Everything inside these markers is my property. I have documentation to prove it." The woman rolled her eyes dramatically. "We're here to make sure you're not taking over the neighborhood," she said sharply. He stayed calm. "I'm not. These stakes mark my property exactly." The surveyor confirmed it. "I've shared this with your office already." There was a pause. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. They muttered quietly among themselves. Clearly they had not expected such organized proof. The woman, however, was undeterred. "We will continue to monitor," she said, "and we will pursue action if necessary." He nodded, silently amused. "You have every right to monitor. Just don't cross the property line." The board left, grumbling, but the woman lingered. She paced along the edge of the boundary, muttering to herself. That day, he realized something important. She didn't care about the law. She cared about control. And control was something she had been used to getting without question. In response, he began small improvements. Not because he wanted to provoke her, but because he wanted to establish normal use of his land. He planted shrubs along the boundary, built a small seating area, and maintained the fence line. Everything he did was documented, photographed, and time-stamped. Every tree planted, every stone laid, every repair made was proof of legal use. Neighbors began noticing again. Some whispered congratulations. Others shook their heads at the ongoing tension. One elderly man, who had lived there for decades, stopped by one evening. "I've seen her do this before," he said quietly. "She always claims land that isn't hers. Stick to the facts, and don't let her get to you." The homeowner smiled. That was exactly what he was doing. Facts. Documentation.com. No yelling. No confrontation without proof. However, he knew that words alone wouldn't stop her. The woman had already shown that letters, complaints, and threats were her tools. And she was growing bolder. Small items began disappearing from the yard overnight. A bird bath moved. A set of wind chimes gone. He assumed she had removed them herself, though he had no proof yet. Still, he didn't act out of anger. He photographed the empty spots, noted the date and time, and left a note on the door addressed to all HOA members. It said simply, "All property within marked stakes is private. Please respect the boundary." Weeks passed and the harassment continued. The woman escalated by walking onto his land while he was away, moving tools, adjusting plants, and taking pictures of his yard, as if to report violations. When he returned home and discovered the changes, he called her. Her tone was defensive, almost theatrical. "I'm just checking on things," she claimed. "You're being paranoid." He remained calm. "Please stay off my property. These stakes mark my land. Any changes you make without permission are trespassing." She didn't respond and hung up. It was clear she had no intention of stopping. But the homeowner also noticed something else. Her anger had made her reckless. Every time she crossed the line, she left evidence. Footprints, moved items, photographs, even occasional witnesses from neighbors. He realized that patience and documentation were slowly building a case far stronger than any argument she could make. One evening, while reviewing the growing collection of photos and letters, he noticed something odd. A few lines in the HOA's letters were copied from previous communications, word for word, suggesting they didn't even read the situation carefully. It was bureaucratic repetition, and that only strengthened his confidence. He was dealing with personal vendetta, not legitimate HOA concern by this time. He had started talking to a small group of neighbors quietly, those who were sympathetic or curious. They shared stories of their own run-ins with the HOA Karen. It was a web of complaints that spanned years. His case wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern. But now he had a clear advantage: official survey, lines, and a willingness to document every step. The woman noticed the change in his demeanor. He was no longer reacting with nervousness or surprise. He was steady, calculated, and that frustrated her. He caught glimpses of her pacing near her door, speaking rapidly to neighbors, and even recording the yard from the street. It became almost comical, watching someone so invested in imaginary ownership. Despite the tension, continued life as normal. He mowed the lawn, repaired the fence, and even installed a small light near the boundary to illuminate the line at night. Every step was legal, every action documented. He realized that her insistence on overstepping the line was only giving him more leverage, and leverage was exactly what he planned to use. He didn't know how it would play out yet. There was no dramatic confrontation planned, no shouting matches, just a careful, steady strategy, facts, documentation.com, and patience. Every time she tried to move the line in her favor, he was ready to show proof. Every attempt she made to control the space would only be recorded and countered. It wasn't revenge yet. Not really. It was preparation, and preparation, he knew, was the most powerful tool anyone could have against someone who tried to bully through. Intimidation rather than reason. By the end of the second month, the woman had begun to realize something. Her usual tactics weren't working. The homeowner didn't respond with fear. He didn't argue aggressively. He didn't back down. And every time she crossed the line, she only strengthened his case. That realization showed on her face. Small cracks appeared in her confident demeanor. She tried to mask it, but neighbors noticed. Some commented quietly about the shift. Others whispered that perhaps he had all the proof he needed. He didn't celebrate. Not yet. Celebration would come later. For now, he continued daily life, continuing to build, repair, and document. He spent time in the garden, fixing broken tools, trimming trees, and enjoying the small moments. The tension from the HOA Kieran's harassment hung in the background. But it no longer controlled him. Instead, it became a game of patience, a test of endurance, and he was ready to see it through to the end. Every day brought small challenges: letters, moving objects, phone calls, and occasional confrontations. Yet each day also brought clarity. The facts were on his side. The law was on his side. And patience, combined with careful documentation, was steadily turning what had been harassment into undeniable proof by the time the third month approached. He had a collection of records that would make any reasonable observer pause. Photos showed each intrusion. Letters showed every threat. And the survey stakes glimmered in the sun as the ultimate proof of truth. The HOA Karen, for all her fury, was trapped by her own actions. She had overstepped, documented herself, and underestimated the homeowner's calm persistence. And the homeowner, quietly and steadily, was preparing for the next phase. It was only a matter of time before the situation would escalate further. The stakes were clear. The facts were clear. And the boundary between patience and action had never been more visible. The morning the fencing crew arrived, the homeowner felt a strange mixture of calm and anticipation. Months of letters, complaints, and small acts of intrusion had led to this moment. The stakes were clear. The survey confirmed every inch of the property line. Today, the line would be made visible in a way no one could ignore, a fence that marked the boundary once and for all. The crew arrived early, carrying wooden posts, panels, and tools. They worked quietly, measuring twice, cutting carefully, and installing each section with precision. The homeowner watched, sipping coffee, his eyes following the stakes he had placed weeks before. Each post went in exactly where it was supposed to, straight, firm, and immovable. It wasn't a show of aggression. It was a show of truth. Across the way, the HOA Karen noticed almost immediately. Her reaction was instant. She came outside, phone in hand, and began pacing along her own yard. At first, she tried calling the board. Then she texted neighbors. Her voice rose as she spoke rapidly into the phone, her tone a mixture of anger and panic. People walking by paused to watch, sensing the unusual tension. The homeowner stayed calm. He didn't wave or shout. He just observed. The fence went up smoothly, section by section, each one reinforcing the boundary that had long been disputed. Neighbors began to gather, curious but cautious. Some whispered quietly, pointing at the line as if trying to understand what had happened. Others nodded to him silently, a quiet acknowledgement that he had every right to do what he was doing. Some even took photos themselves, perhaps sensing that history was being made. The woman finally stormed over, stopping just short of the new fence. Her face was flushed, her words sharp. "You can't do this," she shouted. "This land isn't yours." He set his coffee down and approached slowly. "The land is mine," he said calmly. "The survey confirms it. Every post you see marks the legal boundary."
Ow!
Her hands shook as she gestured wildly. "This is outrageous. I'll call the HOA. I'll call the city." You can call anyone you want," he interrupted gently. "But the line is correct. The surveyor confirmed it. All I'm doing is marking my property." The tone of the confrontation drew the attention of more neighbors. Some came closer, trying to catch words without getting involved. The woman's voice rose, but she was losing control. For the first time, she seemed uncertain. She gestured at the fence as if it were moving on its own. The crew continued their work, unfazed. Each panel installed was a silent statement. He didn't yell, he didn't threaten. He simply documented everything. Every photograph, every video, and every witness added weight to his side of the story. By midday, half the fence was complete. The woman's panic grew with each section. She began pacing, occasionally muttering to herself, occasionally shouting at the crew. When one of them accidentally knocked a stake slightly, she gasped dramatically and called over the homeowner. "It's crooked. You're destroying the property," she exclaimed. He examined it carefully and calmly adjusted the stake. "It's exactly where it should be." The surveyor placed it. "I'm fixing it according to the legal boundary." She shook her head violently, as if reality itself were defying her. "This can't be happening. I will not allow this." He smiled faintly. "You've already allowed a lot. The difference is now the truth is visible." The tension drew the attention of other HOA members. A few arrived, notebooks in hand, unsure of what to do. They spoke quietly among themselves, checking emails and previously filed complaints. The homeowner remained composed, aware that his calm presence contrasted sharply with their growing uncertainty. By mid-afternoon, the fence was nearly complete. The final panels slid into place like pieces of a puzzle. Each section reinforced the property line, cutting through areas that had once been used by the woman as if they belonged to her. It was no longer subtle. It was unmistakable. At one point she walked along the line slowly, stepping cautiously, as if afraid she might fall off an invisible cliff. Neighbors watched quietly from their yards. Some whispered, others shook their heads, and a few smiled faintly at the irony of the situation. For years she had treated this space as her own, and now a solid fence divided it in half. The homeowner didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The fence spoke for itself. It wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity, boundaries, and finally asserting rights that had long been ignored. The woman's panic escalated. She began shouting about taking photographs, filing reports, and contacting city officials. The homeowner listened quietly, recording her words on his phone. Every outburst, every accusation, and every motion became evidence. Neighbors began talking among themselves. Some had lived in the area long enough to recognize her pattern. They understood that this was not just about fencing. It was about control. And now, control was no longer hers. The homeowner spent the evening inspecting the fence. Each panel was straight, the posts were firm, and the line was clear. The surveyor had been accurate, the installation perfect. He didn't celebrate, but he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't victory over her. It was the peace that comes from knowing the truth had been marked physically, visibly, for everyone to see. The HOA Karen, for all her fury, had no legal ground. Every complaint she sent, every letter she wrote, now stood against the undeniable fact of the property line. And while she continued to fume, she could no longer deny what was in front of her. By nightfall, the yard was quiet again, but the homeowner knew this was only the beginning. He had documented everything, prepared for every possible escalation, and remained patient. The fence was more than wood and nails. It was proof, and in legal terms, proof was power. Neighbors began leaving notes, discreetly praising his perseverance. A few even offered help for future projects. It was clear that most people could see what was happening and recognize the fairness of his actions. The woman stayed inside, pacing her rooms, muttering about injustice. But the physical line of the fence could not be moved. The boundary was now undeniable. And as he sat on his porch that night, watching the last light fade over the fence posts, he realized something crucial. He didn't need to shout, threaten, or escalate. Truth, patience, and careful action had achieved what anger never could. The next morning, he found a new letter from the HOA slipped under his door. It was polite on the surface, requesting a meeting, but the words revealed a change in tone. The panic from the previous day was unmistakable. They no longer assumed he would back down. They no longer assumed their threats would work. He didn't rush to respond. Instead, he added it to his growing collection of documentation. Every letter, every encounter, every photograph, all of it built toward the next phase. The fence was complete. The property line was clear. The HOA Karen's panic was visible. And the homeowner knew that, with calm persistence, he had turned months of harassment into undeniable proof. This was not the end. There were still meetings to attend, explanations to give, and perhaps further attempts to intimidate him. But the most important step had been taken. The line was marked, and for the first time, the invisible boundary that had caused so much conflict was now a solid, undeniable fact. The fence would stand as a reminder not of anger, not of revenge, but of patience, preparation, and the power of standing calmly on the truth. Neighbors nodded silently as they passed by, some whispering congratulations, others shaking their heads in disbelief at the spectacle they had witnessed. And in the middle of it all, the homeowner felt something he hadn't felt in months, a quiet confidence that, at last, he was no longer defending territory with words alone. The land itself now spoke for him, clearly and firmly. The HOA Karen, watching from her own yard, realized in that moment that the game had changed. She had underestimated patience and overestimated her own control. And the homeowner, quietly observing her reactions, knew the fence was only the beginning of what would come next. The morning after the fence was completed, the neighborhood felt different. The previous days had been tense, full of whispers and furtive glances, but now the tension had a sharp edge. The fence stood firm, a clear line between the homeowner's land and the space the HOA Karen had been claiming as her own. Its presence was impossible to ignore, and everyone in the area noticed. She woke early, as usual, pacing in her yard. Her face was tight with frustration, her voice muttering to herself as she inspected every inch of the fence. She had tried letters, threats, and whispers to neighbors, but none of it had worked. The fence was real. The stakes were real. The survey was real. She could no longer claim ignorance. By mid-morning, she was on the phone with someone from the HOA, speaking rapidly. Her words were clipped, almost frantic. "It's illegal. He can't just put up a fence on shared land. You have to stop him. We need to intervene immediately." Her audience, whoever was on the other end, tried to calm her. They asked for evidence, documents, anything official, but she had none. All she had was a sense of outrage and years of perceived control. The homeowner noticed her agitation from his porch. He didn't act. He simply observed. He knew her personality well enough to predict her next steps. Letters would arrive, calls would be made, accusations would be leveled, but each move she made now, without proof, only strengthened his position. By late morning, the first of her formal complaints arrived at his door. The envelope was thick, filled with claims of harassment, encroachment, and illegal construction. He opened it calmly, setting aside each page and marking it with the date. Every statement was documented. Every assertion countered by the survey, the fence, and photographs. Neighbors began to notice the escalation. Some approached cautiously, offering advice, warnings, or simply acknowledging the tension. An older neighbor who had watched the HOA Karen's behavior for years leaned over a fence. "She always goes too far," he said quietly. "You're handling it well. Keep everything recorded." The homeowner nodded. That was exactly what he was doing. Every photograph, every letter, every interaction was logged. The fence had become a physical boundary and a silent witness to every act of harassment. By mid-afternoon, a small group of curious neighbors had gathered near the edge of the property. They whispered among themselves, pointing toward the fence. Some expressed admiration for the homeowner's patience. Others shook their heads at the absurdity of the situation. The HOA Karen noticed the small crowd and became visibly agitated, waving her hands and speaking loudly. "You all see this?" she shouted. "This is a violation. He's taking over land that isn't his. Someone needs to stop this." The homeowner stepped forward calmly. "The land is mine," he said, his voice steady. "The survey confirms the boundaries. This fence marks my property legally and accurately. Any changes you make on my side of the line are trespassing." Her face twisted with disbelief. She tried to argue, but neighbors started speaking up. "The survey is official," one said. "You can't ignore it," another added. "It's clearly marked. Everyone can see it." The presence of witnesses seemed to destabilize her. Her usual confidence, built on intimidation and repetition, faltered. She tried to regain control by waving her arms and shouting louder, but it had the opposite effect. Each outburst only made her look more irrational. By evening, the homeowner reviewed the day's events. He had recorded videos, photographs, and notes of everything's letters. Her shouting, the crowd, and her attempts to interfere with the fence. Each act of aggression was proof, each outburst documented meticulously. He realized the power of patience. By remaining calm and letting the facts speak for themselves, he had exposed her pattern. The following days brought more letters from the HOA. This time, the tone had shifted. There were requests for meetings, invitations to discuss compromises, and subtle hints that the board was aware of the legal strength of his position. The homeowner filed each letter, never responding impulsively. He knew that reacting hastily could give them leverage, but ignoring the facts was no longer an option. Neighbors began to talk more openly. They shared stories of previous incidents involving the HOA Karen, how she had overstepped boundaries, made false claims, and intimidated residents for years. The homeowner listened quietly, confirming that his experience was not isolated. Patterns emerged, and with each story, he felt more confident that his careful documentation would protect him if matters escalated further. The HOA Karen, meanwhile, became increasingly erratic. She visited city offices, calling repeatedly to complain about the fence. Officials, after reviewing documents and the survey, confirmed that the fence was within legal bounds. Her frustration grew as every claim she made was denied. The homeowner, aware of these developments through casual neighborhood conversations and official correspondence, remained calm. He had anticipated this reaction. Her aggression was predictable. His patience was not. One afternoon, while trimming the bushes along the fence, the homeowner noticed her attempting to move decorative stones back onto the land she claimed. He approached quietly, taking photographs as he walked. When she noticed him, she froze, staring at the camera. He didn't shout, didn't accuse. He simply continued his work, documenting her actions. The subtle power of evidence was more potent than confrontation. By the end of the week, she had begun sending repeated emails to the board, filled with complaints about harassment and violations. Each email, however, revealed more about her own overreach than it did about his actions. The homeowner filed them carefully, annotating dates, times, and contradictions. He had begun to feel a shift. The board's tone was changing. They were no longer supporting her with unquestioned authority. Doubt had crept into their ranks. Neighbors noticed the shift as well. Some expressed quiet relief, others cautious optimism. The homeowner, however, did not let his guard down. He continued documenting, photographing and monitoring the property. Every interaction, every letter, every phone call was logged. The HOA Karen's every action was becoming part of a growing record. It's a narrative that clearly showed who had the right to the land and who was overstepping. Then came the moment that truly exposed her. A small community meeting was held at a nearby park. The homeowner attended quietly, not to argue, but to observe. The HOA Karen arrived, full of confidence, ready to present her case. She stood in front of the group, pointing at photographs, recounting her version of events. When the homeowner calmly presented his documentation, the survey, the fence photographs, the letters and records of her intrusions, the room fell silent. Each piece of evidence contradicted her claims. The neighbors, some of whom had known her reputation for years, quietly nodded in agreement with his facts. The HOA board members, faced with indisputable evidence, had little choice but to acknowledge the truth. Her face reddened with embarrassment. For the first time, she was publicly challenged in a way she could not control. Her voice faltered. She attempted to argue, but the calm presentation of facts left her with no room to maneuver. The homeowner remained composed, letting the documents speak louder than any words could. After the meeting, word spread quickly. The HOA, Karen's credibility was damaged. Neighbors began speaking more openly about previous disputes, and a few board members resigned quietly, unwilling to be associated with her actions. The homeowner had not sought this outcome, but it was an inevitable consequence of careful documentation and patience. By the following week, the neighborhood's perception had shifted dramatically. The homeowner, who had once been seen as a quiet private resident, was now recognized as someone who had handled an aggressive neighbor with patience, intelligence, and legality. The HOA Karen, on the other hand, was isolated. Her influence diminished. The fence remained, a visible symbol of truth and persistence. It wasn't just wood and nails. It was a boundary marked by law, proof, and patience. The homeowner had not yelled, not retaliated physically, and not broken any rules. He had relied on calm, methodical action and the power of documentation. By the end of the month, HOA Karen's attempts to escalate had dwindled. Her letters were ignored by the board, phone calls went unanswered, neighbors had begun to speak up against her overreach. The homeowner's quiet, consistent approach had turned what seemed like harassment into a public revelation of her pattern. He continued daily routines, mowing, planting, repairing, but now with a sense of security. The community had witnessed the truth. The boundary was recognized, and the HOA Karen, once loud and domineering, was reduced to isolated acts of frustration, each one only further proving his case. The lesson was clear. Patience, evidence, and calm action could outmatch aggression, intimidation, and false claims. The fence was not only a line of land, but a line of integrity, separating truth from fiction. The homeowner had endured months of harassment, but by remaining consistent, he had transformed the conflict into an undeniable exposure of overreach. Neighbors continued to offer quiet support. Some came over to admire the fence. Others shared stories, laughter, and relief that the situation had been handled so effectively. And while the HOA Karen remained frustrated and vocal in private, publicly, her influence had collapsed. The homeowner had achieved a victory not of anger, but of quiet, methodical action. By the end of Part 4, the stage was set. The fence stood firm, the community recognized the boundary, and the HOA Karen's pattern of overreach had been exposed to all. The homeowner had not only protected his property, but had also taught a subtle, powerful lesson. Calm, persistence, careful documentation, and patience were stronger than shouting threats or false claims. The next part would bring the final resolution, peace restored, consequences applied, and the neighborhood returning to balance. The homeowner, fence intact, could finally enjoy the property as he had intended all along. Months had passed since the fence had gone up, and the homeowner could finally feel a sense of calm returning to his property. The early days had been tense, full of letters, complaints, and small intrusions. Now, after careful patience and constant documentation, the HOA Karen had lost much of her influence. Her frantic attempts to challenge the property line had become predictable and ineffective, and the neighborhood slowly adjusted to the visible, undeniable boundary that had been marked on the land. He spent mornings on the porch again, sipping coffee, watching the light shift over the yard. The fence gleamed softly in the sun, each post a symbol, not of conflict, but of order. Life was returning to its quiet rhythm, and he realized how much he had missed this simple pleasure. For the first time in months, he felt that owning property could truly mean peace. Neighbors began stopping by again, this time with friendly waves rather than cautious glances. One family, who had watched the situation unfold from their own yard, came over to compliment him on the fence. "It's solid," they said. "You did it right." And calm, too. We saw how she reacted. He smiled, grateful for their acknowledgement, but he didn't boast. The work had been about maintaining his rights, not winning applause. The HOA Karen, however, did not give up entirely. She continued to send letters, occasionally visit city offices, and call the board, but her tone had shifted noticeably. Where before there had been anger and entitlement, now there was frustration and quiet resignation. Her actions were no longer bold or aggressive. They were careful and hesitant. She had been publicly exposed for her overreach, and even her allies on the board seemed reluctant to engage with her claims. The homeowner continued his routine of documenting everything, though the pace had slowed. Photographs of the fence, notes on landscaping, and copies of all correspondence were filed neatly. The necessity had not vanished, but the threat level had dropped. The power of preparation, he realized, was as important as the action itself. By having everything recorded, he had ensured that any future attempt at harassment could be addressed immediately and effectively. One day, a letter arrived from the HOA board itself. It was concise and formal. It acknowledged the completed fence, the accurate survey, and the homeowner's rightful use of the land. It reminded all parties that property boundaries were to be respected, that further attempts at harassment could lead to fines or legal consequences, and that the homeowner's actions had been within legal rights. The letter was a quiet acknowledgement of victory. The HOA Karen had lost her official standing to challenge him. The homeowner reviewed the letter carefully and placed it in the folder with all previous documentation. It was a moment of quiet satisfaction. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just clarity and confirmation that his patience and careful strategy had worked. Over the next few weeks, he began restoring parts of the yard that had been affected by previous intrusions. Flowers that had been uprooted were replanted. Stones moved without permission were returned to their original spots. Even the small bird bath that had vanished months earlier was replaced. Each act was simple, domestic, and peaceful. Returned to normalcy that reminded him why he had bought the property in the first place. Neighbors noticed these improvements and offered quiet congratulations. Some stopped by with small gifts or friendly words, expressing relief that the situation had finally calmed. A few who had previously avoided him now began to engage more openly,